Welcome to Bespoken Bones with your host, Pavini Moray, connecting ancestors, sex, magic and science. Pavini explores transpersonal tools for erotic wellness every new and full moon, engaging educators, healers, spiritual leaders and scientists in revolutionary dialogue. Get ready to feel good and go deep. This is Bespoken Bones.
Hi, and welcome to Bespoken Bones, Ancestors at the Crossroads of Sex, Magic, and Science, where we're in the business of healing trauma, connecting with our roots, and developing radiant erotic wellness in past, present, and future generations. And I'm your host, Pavini Moray. It's been really lovely, all of the emails that you've been sending, and really happy to hear about how these conversations are landing for you and how you're taking the healing technologies and ideas that the guests offer and weaving them into your own life. And that's really what we're here for, is to support you in being in your sovereignty and getting right with your people and choosing the life that you want to live rather than the life that we get dictated. And feels especially important now to say that now at this really strange moment of cultural intensity. So one of the things that happens when we're hit with unexpected impact like this is we can go into panic or crisis or fear. And sometimes that takes us away from really staying with our aliveness, really staying with our embodied sense of presence, our sensuality or sexuality. And it's really my sense that this is the most important time to be focusing on our aliveness. And that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit today with our guest, Katie Spataro, who I'm going to introduce you to in just a little bit. And also just wanting to name this new project that I've been working on, which is Wellcelium, a mycelial network of erotic wellness spreading throughout the planet. And that this vision of what it would mean for the planet to be erotically well, and how we would be treating ourselves if we were erotically well, and how we would be treating our planet if we were erotically well. And so I think, this is just a great moment to realize that things have had to change for a long time, and now they are changing. We're in this moment. And what would it be to reclaim pleasure? And that's what Wellcelium is about. And it seems maybe frivolous or simplistic, and just, the invitation is to consider, like, well, what's served if you think about this central aspect of your humanity like that? So if Bespoken Bones is really important to your life, I really want to invite you to support Wellcelium. And the best thing you could do would be to sign up for our mailing list on our beautiful new website, which is wellcelium.org, wellcelium.org. So I'm delighted to share all of that with you and really looking forward to learning together in new ways. And so now on with the show. It's such a deep pleasure today to welcome Katie Spataro. And Katie is a full spectrum doula, a somatic sex educator, a holistic pelvic care provider practicing on the unceded ancestral lands of the Duwamish people in South Seattle. Katie studies and practices at the intersections of birth work and sex work, offering trauma-sensitive touch and drawing upon the embodied wisdom of both of those lineages to support healing of the personal and collective cultural body. And I would highly encourage you to check out more about Katie and her work at sacredwombservices.com. And Katie, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you, Pavini. It's really quite special to be here.
It's really a special day to have you here, and you're going to talk a little bit more about why that is, but I wonder if you might just start with a prayer to guide our conversation today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm going to begin this prayer with a breath. And I'm going to invite all of us who are tuning in and listening now to just begin to bring our focus and our attention into our breath as we'll start this prayer from within. Welcoming ourselves, welcoming myself here into this present moment, and then allowing our presence to drop down and settle in. And I welcome from this space within all of the ancestors that supported being able to just arrive here today in this moment, to be talking with you, Pavini. All the support that has aligned itself to be present here, for you to even put this podcast out. All the ways that come together. I want to offer thanks and gratitude for this beautiful morning here in Seattle, for the presence of the below, the unwavering support of the earth beneath our feet during this time of collective activation. Such gratitude for the deep resonance of the earth below us. I want to offer gratitude and thanks for the way in which during this time so much is being activated and rising us up and out of our bodies, and yet there's a reaching of connection, human to human and human to earth. So gratitude and thanks for this connection, this reaching that's happening. And I just want to welcome myself here and welcome my ancestors. And I want to welcome your ancestors here. And may we sit together and be held in loving support. Thank you.
Thank you. And one of the things that the conversation that you and I are having today is in service to is the crossing of one of your dead that happens now. And so just we want to invite that if there's anything you want to add there about that might be good.
Yes, thank you. So we're speaking today on a day that is within a 24-hour period of one of my family members, specifically a cousin who has passed away due to the coronavirus, and several other family members who've been affected and are in stable health, but want to really honor and dedicate this time today and this speaking to ancestral wisdom and erotic wisdom and embodied wisdom in service to my family who is grieving and who is holding in loving support this passing of my cousin.
Thank you. I wonder if that's a good place to dive in today, is to that connection of grief work and erotic embodiment and that intersection. And I know that this is a part of your work, birth, death, sex. So yeah, if it feels okay to just start to speak there about maybe the personal experiences and the personal practices in which you're holding all of this within the framework of being an erotic being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, what comes to me first from that question is the desire to want to name this intimate relationship between pleasure and grief, and my own personal experience of how intricately and intimately connected pleasure and grief are. That sometimes those are thought of as separate, or even as opposite, or that you can't have one and the other, or that if you have one, there's an absence of the other. I don't know that there's a separation between those two, but more and more I'm finding this depth of my own personal experience of how connected pleasure and grief are, and how in working with either of them gives me greater depth of access to both. And I've been cultivating for many years pleasure practice in my life, both as a somatic sex educator. It's my work, but it's also my personal practice. And what I'm finding is that when I work more with pleasure, it gives me greater access to also working with my grief. I feel like I'm someone who can sometimes feel a little cut off or guarded, heart guarded from grief. And that comes from, a childhood as a, child of a divorced family, and really like seeking a lot of independence as a child, and like not always having access to my emotional body. And what I'm finding is that, wow, the more I dive into my erotic pleasure, the greater access I have to my emotional body in the erotic expression of grief. One time I read a quote, I think it was written by Frances Weller, who talked about grief as an erotic coupling. And it was the first time I had heard the word erotic in relationship to grief. And it's so true. One of the things that I do in my practice is I offer healing retreats for survivors of child sexual trauma. And in a recent retreat that we had during a grief ritual, as we were settling in the sort of post-ritual, that sparkly space, that in-between sparkly space of coming down from this deeply climactic experience and checking in with each other, somebody named in the group that felt erotic to them. And so I'm just really working right now with this sense of how grief and eroticism are the same.
I love this. I really love it. And I resonate really deeply with it in my own life and in my own practice, of that when I was finally willing and able to start to attend to grief and build capacity for feeling grief, was actually in the same point in my life where I started being able to feel pleasure, right? That they're so intimately connected. And I like what you just landed on of like, are they actually different? Right. And so often folks are hesitant or reticent or controlled about their feeling of grief or their expression of grief. And I just always am like, well, what is the impact of that on your capacity to feel pleasure, right? Because I do think that if you get beyond the judgment about them, they're kind of the same. Like ecstasy and grief they feel kind of really similar. Is that your experience, Katie?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And I think that there's like an element of permission in there, because as I was, growing up in my 20s, when I was really struggling a lot with what is sex and what is my sexual body, and, this relationship, having grown up Catholic, to what sexual wellness even was, I was finding that I would often cry after sex, and I never knew why. It was just like tears would come and there would be grief and there'd be sadness, but I never really understood why. And this was sex with a loving partner. It wasn't, so it was really confusing to me. And I had a lot of shame and judgment that something was wrong with me around that. And it wasn't until I began studying with the amazing teachers through the somatic sex education program and the sexological body work, one of my teachers named that she loves sad sex. She loves it. And I was like, what? This is what? This is amazing. Like this is not like something's not wrong with you, like there's not something not wrong with me. And I started to like open up and release into this place of like, oh, when I'm actually working with my sexual body and present in my sexual body, tears can be there, grief can be there. All these things can actually be like part of this beautiful soup of what this ecstatic experience is, and that it's okay. So there was an element of like, I needed permission to explore this connection between grief and eroticism.
I mean, I almost feel like we could kind of definitively say, like, if you aren't feeling your grief, you're not going to feel your ecstasy.
Yeah, probably. That's probably true. That's probably true. And it's interesting right now because there's a lot in our world around working with grief. And I'm so glad that, like in my communities around here, there's a lot of places where people are offering grief tending and grief support. So this is wonderful because it also means that we're probably heading towards greater access to our erotic bodies.
I hope so. So yeah, I just am curious, in your practice, do you notice anything about, is there grief that your clients have to move through as part of their healing journey?
Yes, absolutely. And, that was sort of a surprise to me when I started practicing, and now have just, after many years, have just come to understand that it's not only a part that we can't skip over, this grief part of erotic exploration, that it's a part that actually needs to be honored and respected and held gently and with respect, that it's an important part, and often is like a precursor or is something that needs to be worked with first. And particularly in my practice, I work predominantly with women, including cisgender women and trans women and non-binary folks assigned female. I work with a lot of straight folks, queer folks. And what I find is when somebody shows up in my practice and wants to explore feeling more connected to their body, feeling more connected to their pleasure, having more access to feeling in their body and staying present, the majority of the folks I work with are holding and carrying in their bodies either personal or collective sexual trauma, or ancestral sexual trauma. And so very quickly when we begin working together, it's evident that the work we need to do is to name and honor the wounding. And in that, holding a container for grief. Sometimes in my practice, I'll have this wave of clients come in, and with everyone, we're doing rage rituals or we're doing grief rituals first. We're like setting those up, within the container of a session first, before we might do any diving into hands-on working with pleasure and arousal.
And I'm curious, I avoid grief, right? Even though I know it's so helpful in feeling joy and pleasure, it's still like when there's that first invitation to like, oh, hey, Pavini, it's time to feel your grief. I know that I'm like, oh, hell no, I'm out of here, right? Like I have to kind of convince myself like, oh yeah, remember this is a good thing. It's kind of like conflict. It's generative, right? Mm-hmm. And I know that like often there's like grief about having to feel grief, right? Mm-hmm. Or rage about having to feel rage. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. I mean, they're not necessary. What I find is for myself too, and working with my clients is like, if I'm working with those things with myself, like I need help, like, cause I'm not necessarily going to be like, sure, okay, I'm going to sit down and like go into like, I need support. I need someone to hold that space for me, or I need a companion, to grieve and rage with, like, because, and so then I find when I work with clients that I'm often holding that support piece and guiding it, because you're right. It's sort of like, no, I don't want to go there. Do we have to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's like, you're talking about like support, compassionate witness, holding a container, right? I think those are all like for those really big emotions that our nervous systems don't know quite what to do with. It's so helpful to have those pieces in place, right? To kind of just contain the experience enough so that we don't, because it just, so I don't know, for you, it feels like I'm going to like explode out and never come back. And I'm not going to be able to put the pieces back together if I let this big feeling move through my body, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes for me, it's the opposite. I need help getting into that space. I need even help, like I need someone to hold my hand so I know that it's even okay to go in.
Curious about if there's any, like this is tender and I just want to be sensitive with it, but like you just lost a family member and, if there's any guidance or wisdom that you want to share in terms of like what we're talking about, of like, how are you moving with that in your body? How are you moving with that in connection with your erotic self? How are you being with it?
Well, it's interesting because I have been incredibly fortunate that I haven't lost a lot of folks in my life. Like, so for the last 7 years, I've been practicing as a birth doula and a full spectrum doula, working with miscarriage and abortion and birth, of course. And I've been sitting quite a bit at the birth gate, even when that birth gate includes death. But I've been sitting in that field and studying and practicing, shifting and moving throughout that field, harvesting so much wisdom from that space. And I feel like even though I know that this field is the same field at the end of life, it also feels unknown. It feels like a place that's unfamiliar, like new territory a little bit for me. And so at the moment, especially since my cousin's passing has been so quick, so recent and so unexpected, there's a little bit of disorientation for me right now. I feel disoriented. I trust. Like I know enough in the interstitial space that disorientation is important. Like I could feel it in my body, this disorientation at the moment. And what I know from the birth field is that there's a way in which that place of disorientation is a bit of the passageway. It's almost like getting squeezed through the birth canal, right? That there's like this place of what's up, what's down. I'm going somewhere, but I'm not sure where. And kind of pressure or rotation in the body. So I'm sensing and feeling in my body that place. And I'm holding that as this place of transition for my family and for my cousins specifically, and for my ancestry who is now holding this loss as an imprinting in our family, in the blueprint of our family.
Yeah, thanks for being willing to just share your wisdom from such a vulnerable place, and just acknowledging that how important it is for us to hear teachings from folks who are willing to be in those places. I interviewed a friend last summer who was 8 days away from dying, and we're talking about death and sex, and she knew she was dying, and just it's like, what is it to not numb, right? Or to numb as much as we need to, but to like have that commitment to like, and I will come back to full feeling, right? To like that there's something so profound in this that it's actually helpful for me to be here and feel it. And that there's some, I don't know, my sense is that there's some connection with like not dismissing our humanity. Like when we commit to feeling the fullness of our grief, even if it's in small sips and breaths and small moments of it, that there is something that's like so deeply affirming of our humanity, of being human and living fully, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That they're experiences of the body.
Right.
Yeah. Oh.
That's what I was going for.
And that, the tendency for protection is to numb out, right? And that's really fantastic that we have the ability to do that.
That is fantastic. And I don't want to like shame anyone for doing it, but I'm also noticing in this time, and I don't know if this is true for you, but there's a certain kind of sobriety in my life that's happening where there's like the absence of the things that usually work for numbing, and just really having to sit with all of the feelings of, and yeah, there's a disgruntledness about having to do that, but there's also like, oh, this is interesting. What is this new sobriety? What is this being sober in this particular way that I think I hear you leaning into in this experience of losing your cousin? And I wonder if there's anything here that you want to talk to about the intersection for you of sex and death. Because I mean, you're sitting at the gateway of birth, and you're also really reflecting on the kind of the cyclical nature of it. Yeah. And how does that live for you? Sex and death.
Yeah. Wow. I guess it might require me to tap a bit into my own, how I sit in both of those spaces. And very much I've come to the work that I do and who I am at this point in my life by some very significant experiences with sex and death. And the one that comes most to mind is having a miscarriage and working with the element of my erotic body, my sexual body, both conceiving life and giving birth to death. And how up until that point in my life, those things weren't connected, and I didn't really have an embodied experience of those. But I was really, like the rug was really pulled out from underneath me with that experience. It was a profound experience on many levels. And it took me many, many years to sort of understand the experience of my body, my sexual body, to both conceive life and to birth death. And my call as a birth worker really came from a calling towards supporting pregnancy loss, first and foremost. Because what I found with my own personal experience is that there was a huge lack of support. I mean, there's already pretty much a lack of support for people who are birthing children, let alone people who are experiencing pregnancies that don't end in live children. And the reason for that is because it's a experience shrouded in grief and death and working with death. And I saw that there was such a clear need, particularly, and there still is this complete absence of what we call doula support in the birth world, that there's a complete absence of that in around pregnancy loss. And that's changing now, now 12 years after my experience with miscarriage. And it's one of the things that I've been offering for the last 7 years, which is a healing circle specifically to people who've experienced abortion and miscarriage and stillbirth. So along the lines of my healing around a miscarriage and healing around 2 years later, getting pregnant again, birthing a child, and healing postpartum, I also want to maybe just add that my experience with pregnancy and actually birthing my child, who's now 10, was an incredibly sexual experience for me, from my experience throughout my pregnancy to having a profoundly sexual experience actually in the birthing process. And I was really disoriented for many years afterwards, trying to integrate this experience related to my sexual body. In the seeking of integration of this profound, like, rite of passage for my body, I discovered kink. Surprisingly, it was like not something I was seeking out, but it was like, oh, I found myself training to be a doula and working with an experienced BDSM practitioner at the same time, where I was learning the realm of supporting birth and death at the same time that I was diving deep into what erotic exploration was in my own body. And so these things have always been intricately linked for me, just like grief and pleasure. To me, eroticism and birth and death, they are the same.
I just feel like such a big fuck yes to that. Yeah. One of my favorite things about what's happening right now is that the word uncertainty is in everybody's title of everything, like marketing your whatever in times of uncertainty, living through having acne in times of uncertainty. You know what I mean? Whatever the thing is, like learning how to recycle in times of uncertainty. Like it's all about uncertainty. And I'm like, well, the thing is, it's always uncertainty, right? Like this isn't a new thing. Like this is like what it actually, like we're actually getting to see what it is. Mm-hmm. It's always like this. It's never not like this. Mm-hmm. It's just, we think it's not. We live in this like kind of protected or numbed out experience of it. And I hear that in what you're saying, like pleasure and grief, same. Birth, sex, death, same, right? Like these experiences that, they're both sacred and secular, and, mm-hmm. they're both the most mundane thing your body can experience, and, also, the most profound thing, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just really am loving how you're holding it. Mm-hmm. It's great. Mm-hmm. I'm curious about, I want to talk about abortion actually, because I'm curious in terms of, ancestral healing. Like there's, at least in the kind of ancestral healing that I'm trained in, there's like a kind of like a footnote of like, make sure that all of, the stillbirths and the abortions and the unnamed or unclaimed children, like make sure they're all included in the well lineage, mm-hmm. Like pray. But there's never like how, because it's really my sense that the ancestors are, pretty about perpetuation, right? Of species, of lineage, of blood, that they're like, yeah, like I've had a couple of experiences with like clients who are choosing not to have children. We're like I'm super gay, like I am never going to have a child, like that is just not what's happening, and like I hear the ancestors knocking at the door anyway, and I'm like, no way, y'all. Right? And so like when someone, I just haven't heard this conversation very much in the ancestral communities that I'm a part of like, yeah, that decision to not have a child. Mm-hmm. And I'm just imagining that there could be, someone might experience well, obviously they're going to have feelings about it, but just like maybe, feelings of just kind of disconnect with their ancestry about that. If the ancestors are like, knock, 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 have a baby. And you're like, actually, no, I'm not going to do this right now. Like any wisdom or anything you can share, there that could, be easeful and helpful for folks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I've learned a lot from the folks who have showed up in my pregnancy loss group over the many years, about the experience of abortion. And one of the things that strikes me, and I very intentionally hold in this group people who have chosen to terminate and people who have had spontaneous releases of their pregnancy. And in that group are sometimes people who will go on to be pregnant, sometimes people who won't. In other words, it's intentionally inclusive, that it includes anyone who has had the experience of carrying a pregnancy that didn't complete a cycle into a live birth. And within that, there's so much variation. And what I have found is that there's very little difference actually between folks who've had abortion, like elective abortions, I don't even know if that's the right word, who have chosen to terminate, versus somebody who didn't make that choice, energetically and in their body and in their grief, and in the imprinting in their ancestral blueprint of the place of that pregnancy. Meaning that that's not to say that everyone feels the same about their loss. That's maybe, I don't want to, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that everyone feels differently about maybe their personal experiences of pregnancy loss. And I've witnessed and been surprised by that for many and for some that it doesn't matter that, I guess what I'm saying is it doesn't matter that it was an abortion, right? It really more is this sense of there was like a little ancestral knock at the door, like, hey, there's this child that wants to come through. And acknowledging that we live at a time when, not for all, but for some, have the agency to be able to choose whether or not that's right for their body. Like, how wonderful that we have this sovereignty for some. And I want to say it wouldn't really be clear that not everyone has this sovereignty to make that choice or not. That the imprinting of that soul knock, of that conception, is the same as somebody who experiences a pregnancy and miscarries, is the same as somebody who experiences a pregnancy and goes on to have a baby. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Yeah. I guess maybe it's like, I'm curious if there's anything that's different well, maybe not. I'm thinking like parental guilt is parental guilt is parental guilt, right? Like, I'm just imagining that, that there's folks experience lots of different ways of engaging with the loss of a child, and that loss is impactful. What I hear you saying is that loss is impactful no matter kind of what the reason for that loss. Yeah. Am I getting it?
Yeah. One of the things that in the circle that I offer, the healing circle I offer around pregnancy loss, I co-lead with one of my colleagues, June Blue Spruce, who has a background in training and family constellation work. And we bring that into our circle in that we help support the folks who show up there in making a space, like giving place for that pregnancy, whether it was a pregnancy that was terminated or miscarried, that giving that place and honoring it, and we do ritual around that pregnancy, it makes space for it to live, to be alive.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Yeah. Katie, what is the connection, in your opinion, between healing sexuality and working with our ancestors?
It feels like this is the exact same question around grief and pleasure and, around eroticism and life and death. It's sort of like, for me, it's hard to separate the sexual healing of our personal bodies that doesn't relate, right? The connection between our personal sexual healing is intricately connected and cannot be separated from our ancestral lineages. And I want to just maybe speak my own piece of my own experience with that. One of my own early teachings around that, and that is that I often work with one of the ancestors that I work with personally is a future ancestor. So I work a lot with sort of my past and current allies and support, but I also work with an ancestor from the future. And while I was training in the sexological bodywork training, which involved, Pavini, an incredible amount of self-exploration, diving into a communal erotic practice, meeting my own edge, like opening to some really peak erotic experiences that I had during that training, and particularly during the intensive part of that training. One day at the end of that intensive, as I was sitting and tuning into this connection with my future ancestor, this ancestor showed up unrecognized. I was like, who are you? And it was this sense of like, this experience that I was having, really healing my sexual body, changed this future ancestor. And I saw the direct connection that my own healing had an immediate direct impact on this future ancestor that I had been working with. So that was such a profound moment. I had always sort of sensed that the healing work that I do, particularly as somebody who is enculturated as a woman in this world, brought into this world very specifically as a woman two really strong Catholic lineages, both on my father's side and my mother's side. I always felt that my sexual healing related a lot to healing the oppression of female sexuality in the Catholic religion. And I relate to that quite a bit. But I was also just struck at how the healing, my own personal healing, also had direct impact on my future ancestors.
I like that. Future ancestors. Yeah. It's good. It's my sense as well that the healing goes both ways, right? It goes forward and backwards in time. That it's one of those questions of our perceptions of how we perceive the linear quality of it. And the phrase that I really like is the one right now. Like, I am the one right now.
Yeah. Yeah,
like yeah.
I love that. I've been saying that too. There's this sense of like, this is my time, like, oh, I'm the one here right now. Like, how significant is that I'm the one here now?
Yes. And I'm the one who gets to make the decisions for this line right now. And I'm the one who gets to do the healing and the fucking up right now. Right. Like, I'm the one right now. And then there's many others. And like, I don't know, it's just sweet. For me, it's sweet to think of us as a collective rather than a line. Yeah, thanks. I want to ask you, because I know you are doing lots of exciting projects all of the time. And just would you say a few words about kind of some of the things that you've got coming up?
Well, I would say, like a lot of folks, what I'm offering is a bit in flux right now as we reorient to how we are in connection with each other. I do a lot of teaching. I teach one of the tools that I have found most profound and helpful in working with the erotic body and sexual healing is the Wheel of Consent, developed by my teacher, Dr. Betty Martin. And I've been studying and practicing, facilitating groups of folks learning the Wheel of Consent. And I teach workshops, weekend workshops, and about the wheel. And those are experiential workshops. And I'm just beginning to bring those workshops directly to survivors of sexual trauma, along with my colleague, Jojo Bear in the Bay Area. I also offer an annual healing retreat for survivors of child sexual trauma. And I do other classes and support, usually here in Seattle. I've been really resistant for many years, Pavini, to doing anything online. And so I'm having a little like, oh, okay.
The universe is conspiring to advance your work further into the world, Katie.
I know. I'm like, how can we do embodiment work through the computer, right?
Yeah.
So I'm in a big learning curve right now. In the past 2 weeks, I've been shifting my classes and my private sessions online, and frankly, I'm blown away. Kind of. I'm.
It works. It does
wow,
work.
Okay. We can do this.
There's something really profound about it because the client has so much more agency, right?
Yeah. Well, Pavini, most of my individual work is hands-on and hands-in. And so I've just been like, how could I possibly do hands-on, hands-in work through a computer? And, what I'm finding is this, and I'm being called is this way of teaching folks how to do this work on their own body.
Exactly.
And how fucking right is that, right? Like how, yes, that's a big fat yes.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Like, oh, sorry, no more being done to.
Right.
Now we have to, now we have to be able to be with ourselves and touch ourselves.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not trying to be flip about it, but I do think that there's there's so much opportunity here. Right. Katie, if listeners want to find out more about you, what should they do?
I cannot be found on social media very intentionally. So if you'd like to find me, you can find me on my website at sacredwombservices.com.
Great.
Yep, that's the way.
Okay. Great. Well, I just want to say thank you. It's been lovely to deepen into our connection just talking with you like this and hearing stories, and just also wanting to just send that kiss of prayer, of blast of goodness, of kindness, of support, of breath to your blood kin who's crossing right now, and just may they land safely on the other side in the arms of the well bright ones.
Thank you so much, Pavini.
Yeah. Folks who have been listening, glad to have you with us. If it's been helpful, go ahead and go to wellcelium.org, WELLCELIUM.org, and sign up for our mailing list. That's how you can support me for the creation of this podcast. That's what we feel really lovely and reciprocal. So please do sign up for our mailing list. I am Pavini Moray. This is the Bespoken Bones podcast, and we will be back every full and new moon with more embodied goodness and ancestral wisdom.